Okay, welcome again. Um, I'd like to continue where we left off in the last class, in the last lecture, where I was sort of continuing um, two separate lectures on India from the Indus River Valley and the creation of a riverine civilization in that particular complex to its collapse somewhere after the year 2000. And then the emergence of pastoral groups called the Aryans that will gradually infiltrate the Tigris, the Ganges River Valley in India, and eventually move up into the northern hill country above to the north of the Ganges, but also start going south and then begin penetrating the huge plains in central India itself, and sort of are the basis of contemporary Hindu culture and civilization in India. Well, that's a slice of the third chapter, and I've sort of taken it out of sequence with what the text does because I wanted to connect up those two parts of India into a more or less single flow. So we're now looping back to the beginning of the chapter, and it's a chapter about pastoral nomads and the emergence of the first true territorial states in which political powers are expansive at the expense of neighboring peoples who are conquered, incorporated, and the sort of types of political structures that will emerge at that point in time, although we don't get too much about that in the book, right? So he takes us back, the authors, they take us back to the year 2200 BCE. At that point in time, and I think I've mentioned this to you um, in earlier discussions of Egypt, that there are these what are called interdynastic periods that historians have named. They certainly weren't called that by the people living through them at the time, but they're designations given by historians to refer to a period where there is a break in the systemic passage of political dominance, control, civil organization, um, and the emergence of sort of elements of chaos, confusion, tumult, turmoil, um, a breakdown in the system in the truest sense of the terms. Um, and what I have suggested, and what the book certainly does a nice job of doing, is saying, look, recent scholarship has turned to a variety of different areas, and they have been able to correlate, as I suggested, um, the interdynastic periods that we've really been able to increasingly um, pin down to specific points in time as we've done more work and really working out the details of the dynasties, the pharaohs involved, when they lived, when they died, so that we really have a complete spectrum of dates. And with that in hand, then, they've been able to tie that scholarship together with scholarships about geology, the history of the earth, things about climate change, studying climate change, and have been able to really demonstrate that indeed the interdynastic periods uh, correlate exactly with climate change, um, which then, but of course, climate change in the sense of um, decreased rainfall and increased heat. Now, with the systems that we see humanity had developed, these river basin or riverine civilizations, with these systems, it's pretty obvious that the truly determinant factor here is the presence of water and rivers. Even the fertility of the soil is predicated on the fact that the rivers flood, provide them with silt, um, you know, nourish the soil, all of these things, so that ultimately the linchpin of the system is the waters that flow in these rivers that then provide, together with the sunlight, the soil, the perfect setting for the emergence of these civilizations that are able to grow their population, increase their strength, create elite leaders who can rely on the surplus production of the fields to live in their urban centers, never have to work in the fields, all of these things. And so it makes perfect sense then if virtually at the same time we have these three major centers of civilization emerging, and all three of them are directly tied to this riverine formula for success. Should the climate change be virtually global, as we are facing today, if it is indeed broad enough to expand over the Eurasian landmass, particularly in the core areas that we're looking at right here, then we would expect there to be some sort of ramifications, some sort of direct reverberations on the society and the people living there, if indeed this society is built on a framework that depends on the water flowing and the water stops flowing. And we took it a step further. We looked at the pharaoh and the political ideology surrounding the pharaoh, which I kind of believe to have been related to the fact that the shamans would have studied the stars um, as the abode, the heavens, as we say, the abode of the gods, right? And they, being the specialist of the gods in the spiritual life, things like that, would have studied the stars. And if they had moved with their fellow, you know, peasants down to the banks of the river, they might indeed have been able to use their knowledge of the stars and to see that that knowledge coordinates with the flow cycle of the flooding of the rivers themselves. And then you take it a step further, and once you have a you know um, a strong idea that the rivers rise after such and such a constellation, in this case I think it's the dog star, but rises on the horizon, um, then you begin to say that you can predict it. And in a sense, you can predict it, right? Because the two are coordinated, they're correlated. There isn't causality, but there is correlation, right? One appears and the other follows shortly after it, right? So the constellation appears, shortly after that appears the waters, right? Now, what appears to have happened is these kinds of priestly people will take it a step further and create then in the figure of the pharaoh a person who not only predicts the rise of the river, but then is responsible for the rise of the river. And as I suggested, then, damn, if you're going to take credit for it, yeah, you better be ready to pay the price when the river doesn't rise, right? I'm sure that the pharaohs themselves bought in to to a certain extent, will have bought into the ideology of their self-importance in this regard. And indeed, they are born into a structure that has rituals and things like that that they are trained for, and they are treated as if they were divine personages. And so, there wouldn't be any reason for them to doubt that they're not what everyone seems to think they are. And they have these powers because indeed the river rises every year with the prayers and the rituals they say and this kind of a thing. Bang, 2200, the rivers stop rising. And of course, the rivers don't rise. You can't flood the fields. You can't fertilize the fields Um, and so they have like 50 years of drought there, which of course creates chaos and confusion and turmoil and this kind of a thing. But what the chapter wants you to remember, and I think this is important, is that it's not just drought for the settled people, which is the term the textbook used for the settled people, the people living in these cultivated farmlands along the banks of the rivers. We've also seen that in conjunction with this, and certainly that last chapter in Guns, Germs, and Steel, chapter 9, I believe it was, right, lays out the whole sort of complex framework by which humanity has domesticated virtually every one of the large and useful mammals for purposes of food, clothing, whatever it is, draft animals, transportation, right? And so um, at the same time that you have the growth of agriculture and farming in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia, you have groups that then domesticate animals. And the same process that we saw with the domestication, let me do it this way, the same process that we saw with the domestication of plants occurs with animals, which is to say, when you domesticate a plant or when you domesticate an animal, you end up changing the animal, right? You change the plant, you change the animal. And, that's why I had you read that book. I don't want to repeat it again, right? Okay, so what we have is radical changes in the climate, a powerful warming drying trend over Africa, Asia from 2200 to 2150. Not only settled societies, as I said, suffered, but herders and pastoralists too. And they suffer, of course, because in the drought period, the pastures that they rely on are drying out as well, right? So the chapter focuses on the impact of climate change on Afro Eurasian peoples, but specifically people closer in to that core area around the Fertile Crescent, right? Extending up into the Indus River Valley and then into Indian extended areas like that, right? But it is sort of focused rather than going from, the Atlantic Ocean on the French coast to the Pacific Ocean on the coast of China. Um, so the book is going to suggest that certainly what we would imagine um, in the beginning, the first consequences are definitely going to be negative. I mean, we're going to have famine, right? Um, Followed by political as well as economic turmoil. And I've sort of suggested the political turmoil there, particularly for the figure of the pharaoh, who uh, is going to be sort of um, blamed since he took the credit for it before. He's going to be blamed partially for it, but similar things are going to happen in parts of Mesopotamia, and we really don't know. And again, with the Indus River Valley civilization, as fascinating as it is, and it's sort of a kind of a tease for archaeologists and historians, right? Because of the factors that I represented, I suggested that there is an incredible degree of, shall we say, cultural unity across a broad area. And yet at the same time, there doesn't seem to be any indications, first of all, of a writing system. And what writing there is, if it is writing, we're not even sure, right, is minuscule and wouldn't provide us with much help anyway. But beyond that, um, there are no indications of, um, no statues of leaders, no indications of sort of, no palaces, no stuff like that, right? It's bizarre, and so the unity there in that place is at the level of the institutions associated with commerce and trade, which is to say, unified weights and measures, possibly currency prices for things, right? Unified over an area that was, you know, would have been maybe the size of a place like Massachusetts, something like that, right? Um, in any case, um, so we have famine followed by political and economic turmoil. And once that begins and lasts long enough, the old order begins to collapse, eventually falls, and the riverine states that we had seen and paid attention to, from the city states in Mesopotamia to the pharaonic monarchy in Egypt to the Indus River Valley civilization, which, as I just suggested, seems to be centered in issues of commerce and trade, not only amongst themselves, but also with outside areas, as, for example, Sumerian city states. Um, they all seem to collapse virtually at the same time, right? Okay. So, while all this is happening, as I suggested, there is growing turmoil amongst the nomadic pastoralist. That is to say, those people who herd um, animals like sheep and goats, horses, cows, right? Because after all, um, humans use them to mediate between themselves and their needs and the environment. So you have to first fulfill the needs of those animals, which is to say, there has to be food for them. And these are sort of like grassland grazing types of animals that humans have, sort of domesticated for reasons of a pastoral lifestyle. And so, you know, they, in a sense, they're kind of used to doing this anyway. They are relatively nomadic um, in their usual lifestyle, which is to say that they will go someplace, which it's very similar to what we spoke about with the hunter gatherers. That hunter gatherers will go someplace, set up a very very minimal campsite, like 4 6 little huts, right, covered with leaves and made with branches, with an opening that faces the fireplace, right, which is the central hearth of this little community, right. Um, and then once they start exhausting the game life that's there, as well as the what can be harvested, gathered, as the term is, it they're not harvesting because they didn't cultivate it, but they gather it from the surrounding environment. Once that begins to happen, once they've been there for 4 5 6 weeks, and you have to walk further and further to get food, they up and move, you know. And for them, it's really pretty easy because they just get up in the morning, grab their bows and arrows, throw their kids over their shoulders, and walk out the door and head out to wherever they're going. There probably was a lively discussion around the fire the night before. People go to bed with the idea that we're going to get up and leave the next morning, right? Something similar goes on there with pastoral groups. And pastoral groups can sort of um, are often fixated on a single family grouping, but then has kinship relations and forms clans in a tribal setting. And indeed, they will, uh, you know, decide, make a decision. It's time to go, right? The animals have really sort of exhausted most of the available grasses in the area. Let's leave. Okay, because they have a sense of if they eat the grasses too deeply, they may destroy the grasses. And if this is a place that they come to, go out, go out, go out, and then come back to, they don't. There is that sort of sense of stewardship of the environment that they need to sort of not over exploit the grasses, and they will leave, right? But of course, that's part of a daily routine, The book uses the term transhumant, and transhumant pastoralists. There's a famous ethnography of a group in Greece, which I read years ago, and I can't remember either the name of the book or the name of the group. Um, Sarakatsani, something like that, right? But that's not the name of the book. That's the name of the group. And they literally, spend the summers up in the mountains to get away from the heat. Okay. And then in the winters, they come back down and take advantage of grasslands in the lower areas. And they do this on a yearly basis back and forth. And so they have sort of regular relationships with, the text does mention, they have regular relationships with those settled people, the farming people there, and they give back and forth. I think I might have mentioned to you when I was in the Peace Corps in Africa, and I lived with a family, and they were farmers, and they farmed African yams, which are really quite good. They one day a Fulani gentleman, and they herd cattle, stopped in, and he had a special friendship relationship with one of the older men in this sort of extended family that I had rooms in. Peace Corps set this up. It was delightful. I mean, I loved it. But I was, as a sort of a future anthropologist in the making, was very, very much interested in that. And they came in and sat down, started talking. He sent the boy down to the market someplace where he could buy a beer, came back with a beer. They both sat there and shared a beer. Then the Fulani man reached into his bag and took out like a huge round, almost like, uh, well, it was a cheese, and it was about yo thick, and you know, like that, sort of the the width of a frisbee, but like 2 inches thick, uh, and for the people I was living with, it was an absolute delicacy, right? Because they never get cheese, right? And so he sent his wife out, and she came back with, a whole armful of really nice yams, and gave him the yams, and and this kind of a thing. And you want to make sure on both sides they're both happy with it, because after all, if I really like what he's bringing, I have no other access to cheese. I want him to come back, right? So I make sure I give him plenty of my yams, which after all I usually have a surplus of from working hard in the fields and this kind of a thing, right? Um, there are those relationships between the people who herd animals and the people who farm, because they have sort of complementary products from their labors, right? And so we're seeing this, um, particularly in a place like Mesopotamia, where this certainly existed, where they were in the hillsides around, taking advantage of those grasslands that were there, herding their sheep and their goats, and bringing them in for sale in the marketplace, and this kind of a thing. But what's going to happen here is the grass is also drying out there, and so they're being progressively pushed down into the heartland, the farming country, because that's the place that still has access to water from the rivers, or seemingly, um, you know, and so the burden is shared to a certain extent. But what's going to happen is, also in parts of, um, so it's an area between the Black Sea and the Caspian, the Caucasian mountains there, um, and actually to the north of them in the area called Georgia, up in there. Um, those people domesticated horses first. And the let's see if I got it here. Okay, so he really sort of lays out for us, almost like Jared Diamond, the stages. But again, he's not Jared Diamond, so he's going to give us aspects of the broader sort of historical reference here. Um, These groups in that area domesticated horses first. So in southern Russia, in that area there, near Ukraine, but moving more towards Europe there in that area, they domesticated horses as food. Purposes of raising them to slaughter them and eat them, right? Gradually, they began to sort of realize that maybe we can use them for something else, right? And uh, very recently, archaeologists, maybe the last 10 years or so, um, working in that region, came up with fossil heads of horses, which show mm, mm, um, that the teeth back here are ground down. And they are saying this is the earliest indication of uh, uh, an attempt to domesticate horses, now not for food, but for purpose of transport, right? Because it shows the emergence of the hell are they called? Mouth bits that they put in there, right? Okay, and then there are reins and things like that. But the mouth bits weren't there because they believed they were early made out of bone, right? Carved bone. But then gradually they began to make them out of metal. And so later on we get them. So we see the emergence of horses as domesticated animals for food. And then a further stage in the domestication where horses are now tamed for riding purposes, and also then finally for pulling wagons and other things. And what will be the highest level of growth here and development will, of course, be horses that then can lead chariots. And this is kind of like a revolutionary stage in the development of the technology of war. I don't think it's a revolutionary weapon per se. It's more like a technology, a delivery system, right? So apparently, very quickly they developed systems where, and some of the groups that will be famous, right? The Huns and others, um, will, and it's not, actually not the Huns, it's the Mongols, um, will literally, Mongols grow up with horses. If you're a kid there, you learn to ride a horse, like stories about why Brazilians are so amazing soccer players. And, the first thing the dad buys for his young son is a tiny soccer ball. And the kid's still in the crib, and the dad takes his feet and passes the ball back and forth from one to the other, right? Well, it's kind of the equivalent there with the Mongols. Um, they ride without a saddle, so they ride basically bareback, but they were able to, go full speed and with a bow and arrow hit a target going full speed. And this is why they became these fantastic warriors in the year, 1250, um, uh, racing across Central Asia and threatening Europe and things like that, right? Um, so the first example of that is with the chariots. And so groups of pastoralists will emerge with horses and chariots, um, and suddenly you have this emergence of um, people desperate for food, desperate for pasture for their animals, having, if you will, um, a technology of warfare superior to anything that the great um, urban civilizations have developed. And suddenly you have a sort of, um, together with the breakdown in the environment, a breakdown in governance, and eventually these groups will get incorporated into these populations, And members of the core population will observe, copy, and take on these technologies, which after the year 1200 is going to have um, a new metal, iron, which will be able to seal the wooden wheels and make them much more durable, um, entering an iron age of sorts. And the interesting thing about iron was um, it is much more easily available than copper was for making bronze, right? And so you move into a situation in which um, kings and and their representatives don't control the outlets for this. It's almost like what's happening with us with guns in our society. Guns have become so available, right, that it's no longer sort of like um, an elite class technology that can be used to subordinate the population, but rather it's in the hands of everyone, and that's how we gained our freedom. When everyone had some sort of a rifle to go out and hunt with, and that kind of stuff, right? Okay, so now this is happening then, where and it's happening rather quickly. We're really looking at a period of maybe 150 years in which the impact of the environmental change, the breakdown of food systems, um, the turmoil and the interpenetration of pastoral groups and farming groups together, right, struggling for control over the land, right. Um, Out of this, then, will emerge territorial states, which are new types of regimes, and they are sort of, particularly if you compare them to the city states in Mesopotamia, they are breaking out of that mold. They are breaking out of the urban confines of their predecessors, the city states. Because you remember, the city state is a city that has a surrounding area planted with food for the inhabitants of the city, and the city then creates political institutions, systems of taxation, other kinds of things to control the surrounding area. But particularly in Mesopotamia, certainly not for the first 500-600 years, they're really much more concerned with um, openness and trade and commerce and things like that. And each individual city state is dedicated to a different god. Um, so what we now have are territorial states that can exert power over distant hinterlands. And not right away, but pretty soon, distant can get rather big, right? When we do get, say, to the Persian Empire, that will extend, from the Mediterranean up all the way down the Tigris and Euphrates and further into parts of Asia itself, we're looking at what today would be a significantly large nation state. And so they are exerting power over distant areas. And of course, just think about it. This changes the nature of governance. How do I, as the King of Kings, how do I ensure that my governor, 800 miles away in a province behind a bunch of hills, right, out over there, how do I know that he's not so exploiting the population that they hate him and by extension me and would be willing to rise up against me? How do I know that the taxes that he's sending me are a minute amount of the taxes that he's extracted from the people? How do I know he's not raising his own private army to try and attack me and take over the title of King King of Kings, right? All of these questions begin to emerge, and governors, meaning the kings, the emperors, have to sort of ideate, have to come up with ideas of how to indeed, they have to literally think about governance, how I do it, who can I trust? I mean, this is this is the fundamental issue at the heart of politics. Who can I trust? Who can I indeed trust, right? Who can I trust? Because what happens is a process of delegation of power. I give some of my power, I take some of my power, and I give it to someone else to exercise it in my name. And so systems will develop. We'll talk about them in another class in the future, but just keep that in mind, right? What's going to happen, though, is this new chief political innovation of the territorial state creates centralized kingdoms organized around charismatic rulers who have newly emerged upon the scene. Now, what is a charismatic ruler? Well, we'd have to say that Donald Trump, for some people, is indeed a charismatic ruler. When you look at the crowds of people that go to listen to him and go crazy with the stuff he says, and will wait in line for hours to see him, right? This is certainly a charismatic leader. On the other side, we have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just died and was sort of a charismatic leader in her own right, although she wasn't a political leader. She was certainly charismatic and respected by large groups of people, right? Um, so this new system of centralized kingdoms created stabilized political systems by devising rituals for passing command to the next generation. In other words, what are we facing in the next election? In the next election, it appears as if Donald Trump is preparing the country for the fact that if he loses, he will declare the election a fraud. In other words, one of the things that has separated this country from other countries that have fallen into civil wars or have simply, there's been an election and they announce the winner, even though 90% of the people hate the guy who's in power. And they say he's won again. What a great election, right? This kind of a thing. That in this country, Hillary Clinton, as much as she probably despised Donald Trump, said, okay, yeah, let's not take the country to violence and civil war. We have enough of that going on. I will wish President Trump good luck. Well, yeah. And Barack Obama, the same thing, goes to the inauguration of Trump and wishes him well and receives him in the White House, and they, take him for a tour and all these kinds of things, right? Um, you know, um, if Donald Trump, he may win. If he wins, then we won't have that issue. If he, say, wins the first night, because there are still votes to be counted, and he says, okay, anything after tonight is not a valid vote, right? I am the winner. Stop counting, right? And he's pushing to get another judge in the Supreme Court to ensure that he can get a decision that will keep him in power. Those are the kind of things that created stability 3,000 years ago, 4,000, or what are we saying? About 3,500 years ago, almost 4,000 years ago, when they created stable systems of power going from, say, father to son, right? Or I choose the person who will replace me so that there is no doubt who will take over after me. I mean, that's always an issue. When we look at Rome, we're going to see a place that um, has um, constant turmoil at the top for a long period of time. In any case, so rituals for passing command to the next generation. What will happen then, and this is a significant cultural shift, people feel allegiance to large territories, to rulers, to ethnic and linguistic communities. This is new. This is something new, right? And so with the Sumerian city states, every person was sort of an inhabitant of a city state dedicated to a specific god, and that was their sense of self identity. They identified with them, with the city state, with the god there. Now you're moving in the direction of ethnic and linguistic communities, much larger territories, right? And eventually a place like Rome will work very hard to try and create a sense of citizenship amongst a conquered population, right? We'll look at that later, right? Um, City states, on the other hand, were organized around temples, as we saw. The temple was often the first structure in the city state. It will morph into the ziggurats, the most significant um, piece of monumental architecture that they have, right? There will be palaces, right? And so they're organized around the temple and then increasingly the city state, the palace later on, right? Um, and they were autonomous polities. They did not owe their allegiance to anyone else. They made their own rules, their own laws, until they are conquered. Sargon of Akkad, 2350, will come back, followed by um, the, what's its name? Okay. Okay. Don't write it down. I can't remember names, right? Okay. So the new territorial states will base their authority on monarchs who have great pomp and circumstance and this kind of thing, and put up statues to themselves and stuff like that. Um, what else? Bureaucracies, the emergence of bureaucracies, some of which we saw beginning in the early Sumerian city states with the writing systems and things like that, and scribes. But they're also developing elaborate legal codes. The Code of Hammurabi, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, large territorial expanses, as I suggested, um, with definable borders, but also with ambitions for further expansion, right? So let's quickly look at some of the examples here. And so Egypt, after the decline of the Old Kingdom in 2200, goes through an interdynastic period, such that by, let's see, by 2050, actually by 2010, you have something called the Middle Kingdom grows and develops, which represents a new consolidation of power by a group of native Egyptians, shall we say. And they will hold on for a period of time until there is a new interdynastic period with, again, the river not running and things like that, so that in the year 1640, they begin to face the same kind of challenges. And it will take them 90 years to sort of get over, have the waters run again. And so in 1550, we have the New Kingdom. Now, what the text is going to show you is these shifts in structure, nature of governance, and things like that are also tied to cultural changes. Certainly, one of the significant cultural changes in a place like Egypt is the emergence of new gods, which suggests that either people in different areas or new people coming in. Some of those masses of pastoral nomads who have been incorporated into the group, who may be some of the people gaining power at this particular point in time, then bring new gods with them, which begin to define, if you will, sort of the new period that they're in, right? They become associated with that new period. Ultimately, in the New Kingdom, that period from 1550 to 1070, two things happen. Prosperity begins to grow and develop, but also by this point in time, Egypt sees the need for empire, for expanding what people call a buffer zone between itself and the Semitic peoples in the upper regions of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, who are threatening to invade. In fact, Egypt had been invaded by a group called the Hittites, who came out of what was Turkey and came down and invaded for a short period of time. They were actually another and indeed the earliest example of Indo-European speakers. They are the first, oldest example that we have of an Indo-European language arriving with groups of nomadic pastoralists, just like the Aryans in India, and just like the Greeks arriving in Greece. Um, and so they're there as well, right? When they are driven out, the Egyptians then will conquer all the way up to the Mediterranean, along the coast of the Mediterranean, and take a buffer zone there as a form of protection against possible invasions, right? Same thing is going to happen in Mesopotamia, where, as I mentioned in the last lecture, for a variety of reasons, the richest areas in the delta regions of the south, the southernmost regions of the Tigris Euphrates. Um, Again, there's a drying out period. The waters of the sea begin to invade. The river changes its channels. That, together with the invasion of pastoralists, really signals by 2000 the end of that rich area in the south there. And everything is moving north. And so we're going to have the emergence of um, Babylon up on the Tigris and Euphrates River, not too far from where Baghdad is located today, right? And so you get then a Semitic people, just like the Akkadians with Sargon, who were a Semitic speaking people. Hebrew and Arabic are the two major Semitic languages in the world today. So that happens there. And gradually you get them, if you will. Uh, I'm not going to answer that. Yeah, they finished. Okay, where was I when I was so rudely interrupted? I want to finish this because I know this is getting a bit long. How long is it? Okay, yeah, just about 50 minutes. That's too long. Okay, so and the one last thing is there's a group called the Hittites, um, as I mentioned, who will also emerge up in there. And so that whole part of the world now begins to get consolidated by these new territorial states that use chariots as weapons of war, means of warfare, gain control, and indeed will actually sort of um, raise the level of organization in governance um, as they confront these new issues of going out and conquering ever larger pieces of land with more people involved in it who are now being incorporated in it and has to somehow be integrated into the fold of governance and politics and things like that. Okay. By the way, thank you for your essays on guns, germs, and steel. Um, they were quite interesting, and for the most part, they were really quite well done. Thank you.